Sometimes the deepest bonds are formed in the most unexpected moments. When Caleb Hargrove found that tiny bear cub crying by the creek, both their lives were about to change forever. The folks in town thought he'd lost his mind. A grown man, trying to raise a grizzly bear? They called him crazy, dangerous, and worse. For years, they laughed and whispered behind his back. They waited for the day that Bear would turn on him. But Caleb saw something different in those small, trusting eyes. Something that reminded him of the family he'd lost long ago. As the seasons passed, man and bear became an unlikely pair in the Alaskan wilderness. Then came the summer of 1989, when a massive wildfire swept down from the mountains, threatening to destroy everything. What happened next would silence every critic and doubter in that small town. How could one man and his unusual companion change everything? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning mist clung to Miller's Creek like a memory that wouldn't fade, and Caleb Hargrove understood that feeling better than most. 23 years he'd called these Alaskan mountains home, but it was only the last 20 that truly counted. The years since he'd stopped being a husband and father and became something else entirely. Something harder. Something lonelier. His weathered cabin sat tucked against a stand of ancient spruce, every log cut and fitted by his own hands during those first raw months after the accident. Back then, building had been survival, something to keep his mind occupied while his heart learned to beat around the hole that Marie and Emma had left behind. The structure bore the marks of a man who'd had too much time to think and too much grief to carry. Every joint was perfect, every corner square, as if precision in carpentry could somehow balance out the chaos that had torn his world apart. The cabin was more than shelter now. It was sanctuary. Thick walls that kept out the wind and the world, a stone fireplace that had warmed countless solitary evenings, and windows positioned just so north toward the peaks where he ran his trap lines, south toward the distant glow that marked the town of Cedar Ridge, close enough to reach when supplies ran low, far enough away that people mostly left him be. Most people. Anyway, Caleb stepped onto his covered porch, coffee steaming in the morning air, and surveyed his domain. 40 acres of deeded land surrounded by wilderness that stretched unbroken to the Canadian border. A man could lose himself up here, and many had. The difference was, Caleb had found exactly what he was looking for when he'd come to lose himself peace. If not happiness. Purpose, even if it wasn't the purpose he'd once imagined. His trap lines were legendary in these parts, spoken of with grudging respect, even by those who questioned his sanity. Caleb could read sign like other men read newspapers, could predict weather patterns days in advance, and could move through country that would swallow city folk whole. The old-timers in Cedar Ridge remembered when he'd first arrived, a broken logger from the lower 48 with skills that translated well to this harsh country and demons that made him embrace its solitude. Strange bird, that Hargrove? They'd say at Mitchell's General Store, the words carrying weight born of 2 decades of observation. Good enough man when you need him. But there's something not quite right about anyone who chooses to live that far out, that alone. Sarah Mitchell, who'd inherited the store from her father 5 years back, had a more charitable view. A practical woman in her early 40s with graying hair she kept pulled back in a sensible bun. Sarah understood something about carrying on when life dealt hard blows. Her own husband had died in a logging accident, leaving her to raise 2 boys and run a business in a town where winter lasted 8 months and gossip had to stretch to cover all of them. Caleb's not strange, she'd tell anyone who'd listen. Usually while wrapping their purchases in brown paper with efficiency born of long practice. He's wounded. There's a difference, though most folks are too busy talking to notice. Dr. Harold Peterson was another matter entirely. At 67, Doc had delivered half the town and buried the other half, which gave him a perspective on human nature that most people lacked. He'd been the one to patch up Caleb's hands during those first brutal months of cabin building, when grief and inexperience had left him torn and bleeding more often than not. "Man's got good instincts," Doc would say when pressed for an opinion. "Knows when to push and when to back off. That counts for something in my book." Mayor Robert Collins, on the other hand, had never quite figured out what to make of Caleb Hargrove. A political creature by nature, Collins understood the give and take of small-town relationships, the careful balance of favors and obligations that kept a community functioning. Caleb operated outside those rules, appearing when needed but never, staying long enough to be properly cataloged and filed away. He pays his taxes and keeps to himself, Collins would admit when the subject came up at town council meetings. "Can't ask much more than that, I suppose. Still, there's something to be said for being part of the community, not just adjacent to it." The morning Caleb's life changed forever started like any other. He'd risen before dawn, as was his custom, and checked the weather glass his father had given him 30 years ago. The mercury was steady, the sky clear, with the kind of crystalline quality that promised a good day for walking the trap lines. Spring runoff had the creek running high and fast, full of the urgency that comes when winter finally loosens its grip on the high country. He planned to check the northern line first, a circuit that would take him past the old mining claims and up into the country where the big bucks summered. It was there, at the bend where Miller's Creek curved around a stand of aspen, that he heard the sound that would reshape everything he thought he knew about second chances. At first, he thought it might be a bird, some kind of distress call carried on the morning air. But as he moved closer, pushing through willows still heavy with dew, the sound resolved into something that made his chest tighten with recognition. It was the cry of something young and lost, pitched in a register that spoke directly to every protective instinct he'd thought died with his daughter. The Grizzly Cub was maybe 3 months old, small enough to fit in a large man's hands, but already possessed of the distinctive humped shoulders and broad face that marked it as one of Alaska's most formidable predators. It was soaked and shivering at the water's edge, its dark fur matted with mud and debris. Dark eyes, surprisingly intelligent for something so young, fixed on Caleb with an intensity that was both heartbreaking and unnerving. There was no sign of the mother, which Caleb knew meant the cub was as good as dead. Grizzly sows were fiercely protective of their young, and no healthy female would abandon a cub this age unless something catastrophic had happened. He'd seen enough poaching sign in the past few weeks to guess what that something might have been, and the knowledge left a bitter taste in his mouth. The smart thing, the safe thing, would be to walk away. Alaska was full of orphaned animals, and nature had its own brutal efficiency when it came to dealing with the weak and unprotected. A man could drive himself crazy trying to save every lost creature he encountered, and Caleb had learned long ago that some kinds of crazy were more dangerous than others. But something about those dark eyes stopped him cold. Maybe it was the way they seemed to hold his gaze without the panic he'd expect from a wild animal. Maybe it was the particular quality of the cub's cries, which sounded less like random distress and more like a deliberate call for help. Or maybe it was something deeper, a recognition that passed between two creatures who understood what it meant to be alone in an indifferent world. Caleb knelt beside the creek, close enough that he could see the cub's ribs through its wet fur, close enough to count the individual whiskers on its small muzzle. The animal watched him with an alertness that seemed far beyond its months, head tilted in a gesture that was almost quizzical. "What happened to your mama, little one?" Caleb whispered, his voice rusty from days of solitude. "She wouldn't have left you here by choice." The cub's response was immediate, a series of soft chuffs and whimpers that sounded heartbreakingly conversational. It took a tentative step toward Caleb, then another, until it was close enough to touch. When Caleb extended his hand, palm up and fingers relaxed, the cub sniffed carefully before pressing its small black nose against his weathered skin. The contact sent something electric through Caleb's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in 20 years. It was the same sensation he'd felt the first time Emma had wrapped her tiny fingers around his thumb. The same jolt of connection and responsibility that had transformed him from a man into a father in a single heartbeat. He tried to tell himself it was different. This was a wild animal, not a child. A predator that would grow to weigh 400 pounds and possess the strength to tear a man apart without effort. Taking it would be madness, dangerous for him, and ultimately cruel to the animal. But the cub had begun to shiver more violently, and its breathing was becoming labored. Whatever internal debate Caleb might have had was ending with the practical certainty that this small creature would be dead before nightfall if he did nothing. Emma always wanted a puppy, he said quietly, surprised to hear his daughter's name, spoken aloud after so many years of silence. Your mama's not coming back, is she? And I can't just walk away. The decision, when it came, felt less like a choice and more like an inevitable conclusion to a conversation he'd been having with himself for 2 decades. Caleb shrugged out of his heavy wool jacket and wrapped it around the trembling cub, lifting the small weight against his chest. The animal relaxed into the warmth immediately, its cries fading to contented rumbles that vibrated against Caleb's ribs. The walk back to the cabin took on the quality of a dream or perhaps a nightmare, depending on how you looked at it. Caleb knew he was crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed, making a commitment that would change everything about his carefully ordered solitude. But the weight of the cub in his arms felt right in a way that nothing had felt right for a very long time. By the time he reached home, his mind was already racing ahead to practical concerns. The cub would need warmth, food, and medical attention. He had some veterinary supplies left over from his trapping days, and there were books in his collection that covered wildlife rehabilitation. It wouldn't be easy, but then again, nothing worthwhile ever was. The town would have opinions, of course. Cedar Ridge was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, and a man raising a grizzly bear would provide enough gossip to last through the next 3 winters. But Caleb had stopped caring about other people's opinions the day he'd buried his family, and he wasn't about to start again now. As he pushed through the cabin door, the cub still bundled in his jacket, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest, a loosening of muscles he'd held tight for 20 years. For the first time since the accident, he had something to care for besides himself, something that depended on him completely. It was terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, and as he knelt by the fireplace to build up the flames, Caleb found himself smiling for the first time in longer than he could remember. The first night nearly broke them both. Caleb had fashioned a makeshift den in his workshop from an old wooden crate, lined it with wool blankets, and positioned it close enough to the wood stove to provide steady warmth. The cub he'd started calling it Bear, for lack of imagination and an abundance of practicality, had seemed content enough at first, curled into a tight ball and making soft rumbling sounds that reminded Caleb of a cat's purr. But as the hours passed and the reality of separation from its mother set in, Bear's contentment gave way to distress. The cry started around midnight, plaintive wails that cut through the cabin walls like a knife through butter. By 2 in the morning, the sound had evolved into something that made Caleb's chest ache with sympathetic pain. He'd tried everything he could think of, adjusting the temperature, offering water from a spoon, even playing his old radio at low volume in case the sound of human voices might provide comfort. Nothing worked. Bear wanted its mother, and no amount of good intentions could fill that particular void. The feeding bottle had been Caleb's most ambitious project, carved from a piece of soft pine and fitted with a leather nipple fashioned from an old glove. It was crude but functional, and after several failed attempts, Bear had finally begun to nurse from it. The sight of the small creature taking nourishment from something he'd made with his own hands stirred feelings in Caleb that he'd thought were buried forever. By morning, both man and cub were exhausted but alive. Bear had managed to keep down several ounces of diluted milk, and Caleb had managed to catch perhaps an hour of sleep in the workshop chair. It wasn't sustainable, but it was a start. The routine that developed over the next few days was simple in its demands but complex in its implications. Bear needed feeding every few hours, attention and warmth, and increasingly companionship. The cub had begun to follow Caleb around the cabin, staying close to his legs and making soft conversational sounds that seemed to demand responses. Caleb found himself talking back something he hadn't done with another living creature in years. At first, it felt awkward and self-conscious, but Bear's obvious pleasure at being spoken to gradually wore down his resistance. Soon, he was providing running commentary on everything from the weather to his breakfast preparations, and Bear would listen with the kind of focused attention that most humans never bothered to offer. It was inevitable that word would reach town. Cedar Ridge was too small and too isolated for secrets to survive long, and Caleb's weekly supply runs were as regular as clockwork. When he failed to appear at Mitchell's General Store for 2 consecutive Saturdays, speculation began to build. Sarah. Mitchell was the one who finally made the trip out to his place, using the excuse of checking on his welfare, but driven by genuine curiosity about what could keep a man like Caleb away from his normal routines. She found him in the yard, splitting firewood while Bear played nearby, rolling in a patch of new grass and occasionally pouncing on invisible prey with the kind of focused intensity that only the very young possessed. "Good Lord, Caleb," Sarah breathed, her hand rising instinctively to her throat. "Tell me that's not what I think it is." Caleb straightened slowly, axe still in his hands, and met her gaze with the steady calm he'd perfected over 20 years of solitude. "Depends on what you think it is, Sarah." "That's a grizzly cub." "Yes, it is." The simplicity of his response seemed to knock the wind out of whatever argument she'd been preparing. Sarah stared at Bear, who had noticed the new arrival and was watching her with bright, curious eyes. "Caleb," she said carefully, "do you understand what you're doing?" "I'm taking care of something that needed taking care of," he replied, setting down the axe and brushing wood chips from his hands, same as anyone would do. "This isn't a stray dog, Caleb. This is a wild animal, a dangerous wild animal." Bear chose that moment to tumble backward in pursuit of its own tail, ending up in an undignified heap that would have been comical if the creature in question weren't capable of growing into an apex predator. Sarah's expression softened despite herself. "Where's its mother?" "Dead, most likely. Found the cub by Miller's Creek, half drowned and starving. Mother wouldn't have left it unless something bad happened." Sarah nodded slowly. She'd lived in Alaska long enough to understand the brutal mathematics of wilderness survival, the thin margins that separated life from death in country that didn't forgive mistakes. "You can't keep it, Caleb. You know that, right?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying fire. Caleb watched Bear investigate a butterfly with single-minded determination, tiny paws batting at air as the insect danced. "Just beyond reach. Maybe not forever," he said finally. "But for now, it needs someone. And He paused, seeming to wrestle with words that didn't come easily. "I need something to need me, I guess." Sarah's expression shifted from concern to understanding, and Caleb saw the exact moment when she grasped what this was really about. Not just a man and a wild animal, but a man and a chance to be something other than what grief had made him. "People are going to talk, Caleb. You know how they are. People always talk. Doesn't change what needs doing." The conversation that followed was gentle but firm. Sarah explained the concerns that would inevitably arise: safety issues, legal complications, the simple fact that raising a grizzly bear wasn't something normal people did. Caleb listened with the patience of someone who'd already considered every argument she might raise. "I know what people will think," he said when she finished. "They'll think I've lost my mind, living out here alone for so long." Maybe they're right. But that cub was going to die, Sarah. Die alone and scared and hungry. I couldn't walk away from that. News of Caleb's pet bear spread through Cedar Ridge with the speed of wildfire. By the time he made his next supply run, the story had grown in the telling until it bore only passing resemblance to reality. Some versions had him wrestling the cub away from its mother. Others suggested he'd been raising wild animals for years and just now been found out. The reception at Mitchell's general store was chillier than usual. Conversation stopped when he entered, and he could feel eyes following him as he gathered flour, coffee, and the canned milk that had become essential to Bear's diet. When he approached the counter, Sarah's smile was strained with the effort of pretending everything was normal. "How's your project coming along?" she asked quietly. "Well enough," Caleb replied, counting out bills from his warm leather wallet. "Growing fast." Mayor Collins chose that moment to enter the store, flanked by two other members of the town council. The timing felt deliberate, and Caleb braced himself for a conversation he'd been dreading. "Caleb," Collins said with forced joviality, "just the man I wanted to see. Here, you've got some kind of unusual houseguest. News travels fast." "It does." Indeed. Collins's smile never wavered, but his eyes were serious. "Mind if we have a word outside?" The confrontation that followed was civil but firm. Collins explained the town's concerns about public safety, liability issues, and the precedent that raising wild animals might set for other residents. Caleb listened without interruption, his face betraying nothing of what he was thinking. "I understand your position," he said when Collins finished. "But that cub isn't a threat to anyone. Now, maybe. But what about in 6 months? A year? Grizzly bears aren't pets, Caleb. They're wild animals, and wild animals are unpredictable. So are people," Caleb replied mildly. "Hasn't stopped us from living together." The mayor's patience was beginning to fray. "This isn't a joke, Caleb. I've got constituents who are genuinely concerned about their safety. I can't just ignore that." "Then, maybe you should come see for yourself before you make any decisions," Caleb said. "You're all welcome anytime." It was a challenge and an invitation rolled into one, delivered with the quiet confidence of a man who believed absolutely in what he was doing. Collins opened his mouth to respond, then seemed to think better of it. "We'll be in touch," he said finally. As Caleb loaded his supplies into the truck, he could feel the weight of the town's attention pressing down on him like a physical force. Part of him wanted to explain, to make them understand that this wasn't about recklessness or some misguided attempt to prove a point. It was about responsibility to a creature that had no one else, and to something inside himself that had been dormant for too long. But explanations required a level of emotional vulnerability that Caleb hadn't practiced in 20 years. So instead, he climbed into his truck, started the engine, and headed home to where Bear would be waiting, the only creature in the world who accepted him exactly as he was, without judgment or expectation or fear. The die was cast now. Whatever came next, there would be no going back to the careful solitude he'd maintained for 2 decades. For better or worse, he was no longer alone. Asterisk 3 months had transformed everything. The tiny, trembling cub that Caleb had carried home in his jacket had grown into a robust young bear with boundless energy and an insatiable curiosity about the world. Bear was now the size of a medium dog, his dark fur thick and glossy from regular meals and constant care. More importantly, he had developed a personality playful, intelligent, and utterly devoted to the gruff man who had saved his life. Caleb's daily routine had evolved around Bear's needs in ways that still surprised him. Morning feeding came first, followed by what he'd started thinking of as outdoor time-supervised exploration of the yard and surrounding area while Bear learned the boundaries of his territory. Afternoons were for training, though Caleb was beginning to suspect that Bear was training him as much as the other way around. The young bear had an uncanny ability to communicate his wants and needs through a combination of vocalizations, body language, and sheer persistence. When he was hungry, he would sit beside his feeding area and make soft chuffing sounds until Caleb paid attention. When he wanted to play, he would bring objects to Caleb's feet and look up expectantly. When he was tired, he would curl up beside Caleb's chair and make contented rumbling sounds that seemed to vibrate through the floorboards. It was during one of these quiet evening moments that Caleb's eyes had fallen on the small wooden horse that sat on his mantel, a child's toy carved from birchwood and worn smooth by countless small hands. Emma had carried it everywhere during her 4th year, creating elaborate adventures and talking to it in the serious, confiding tone that only children could master. Seeing it now, with Bear sleeping peacefully at his feet, Caleb felt a familiar tightness in his chest. But for the first time in 20 years, the pain was accompanied by something else, a bittersweet recognition that love didn't diminish when it was shared, even across species lines. Bear had awakened something in Caleb that he'd thought was gone forever. The protective instincts of a parent, the fierce, unreasoning commitment to another being's welfare that made all other considerations secondary. It was the same feeling that had driven him to work double shifts at the mill to save money for Emma's college fund. The same impulse that had made him check on her 3 times every night when she had a fever. The realization was both comforting and terrifying. Caring about something meant risking loss, and Caleb had sworn never to make himself that vulnerable again. But Bear's trust was absolute and uncomplicated, demanding nothing more than presence and consistency. It was a kind of love that Caleb could manage simpler than human relationships, but no less profound. The first sign of real trouble came on a Tuesday morning in early June. Caleb had let Bear explore the area around the woodshed while he repaired a section of fence. The young bear was investigating a fallen log with typical thoroughness when the sound of an engine broke the morning quiet. Caleb looked up to see his truck, parked near the house with both windows down, surrounded by what looked like confetti. As he got closer, the confetti resolved into shredded upholstery, torn paper, and the remains of what had once been his work gloves. Bear stood in the truck bed, tail wagging with obvious pride at his accomplishment. He had somehow managed to climb into the vehicle and systematically destroyed everything within reach. The dashboard was scratched, the seat covers were in tatters, and his radio was hanging by its wires like a technological casualty of war. "Well," Caleb said quietly, surveying the damage, "I guess we need to talk about boundaries." The vandalism to his truck was nothing compared to what awaited him in town the following Saturday. Someone had spray-painted "Bear Lover" across his tailgate in red letters, and his windshield was decorated with a collection of notes that ranged from concerned warnings to outright threats. "You're gonna get someone killed," read one. "That thing should be put down before it kills you," suggested another. The most hurtful message was written in careful script on what looked like church stationery. "God didn't intend for wild animals to live with people. You're going against nature, and nature always wins." Sarah Mitchell was waiting for him inside the store, her face tight with concern. "Caleb, I'm so sorry. I've been trying to keep track of who's been spreading the worst of it." "But it's not your fight, Sarah," Caleb interrupted gently. "People are scared. I understand that. Do you?" "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like they're being cruel for the sake of being cruel." Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking about the notes in his truck and the whispered conversations that stopped whenever he entered a room. The isolation wasn't new. He'd been living on the margins of this community for 20 years. But the active hostility was something different, and it made him wonder if he'd miscalculated the price that Bear would have to pay for Caleb's choices. "Maybe they're right," he said finally. "Maybe I'm being selfish, keeping him." Sarah's response was sharp enough to cut glass. "Caleb Hargrove, that's the first stupid thing I've ever heard you say. That bear is healthier and happier than any wild animal I've ever seen. You're not keeping him, you're raising him." Her words stayed with him during the long drive home, and they were still echoing in his head when he found Bear waiting by the porch steps, ears perked and tail wagging with the uncomplicated joy of reunion. The young bear bounded toward the truck as soon as Caleb opened the door, rising on his hind legs to rest his front paws on Caleb's chest in a gesture that had become their customary greeting, standing there with 60 pounds of bear pressed against him. Caleb felt some of the day's tension begin to drain away. This was what mattered, not the opinions of people who had never bothered to know either of them, but the simple reality of trust and affection that connected two unlikely companions. That evening, as Bear dozed by the fire and Caleb worked on carving a new feeding bowl to replace the one that had been destroyed in the truck incident, he found his thoughts drifting to Emma and the wooden horse that still sat on his mantle. She would have loved Bear, he realized, would have understood immediately what others seemed incapable of grasping, that love wasn't diminished by being given to an unusual recipient. The memory that surfaced was from Emma's 5th birthday, when she had found an injured sparrow in their backyard and spent 3 days nursing it back to health. Caleb had tried to explain that wild birds were better left alone, but Emma had been adamant that anything hurt deserved help, regardless of species. "It's not about what kind of animal it is, Daddy," she had said with the absolute certainty that only children possess. "It's about what kind of person you are." The sparrow had eventually recovered and flown away, but Emma's words had stayed with Caleb long after his daughter was gone. Now, watching Bear sleep with the perfect trust that only the very young or very secure could achieve, those words seemed more relevant than ever, whatever challenges lay ahead, and Caleb had no illusions that the town's hostility would fade. Quickly, he was committed to this path. Bear had given him a second chance at being something other than a man defined by his losses, and that was worth fighting for. * by his first birthday, or what Caleb estimated to be his first birthday. Bear had grown into something that could no longer be dismissed as cute or harmless. At nearly 200 pounds, he was already larger than most adult black bears, with the massive bone structure and distinctive shoulder hump that marked him as a true Alaskan grizzly. His playful tumbles had been replaced by movements that carried real power, and his gentle nips during play could leave bruises on Caleb's arms. But it was the intelligence behind Bear's dark eyes that truly set him apart from any wild animal Caleb had ever encountered. The young grizzly had learned to respond to more than a dozen verbal commands and twice as many hand signals. He knew the difference between stay and wait, understood when Caleb needed him to move aside or come closer, and had developed his own repertoire of vocalizations that seemed tailored to specific situations. The communication system that had emerged between them was unlike anything Caleb had ever experienced. Bear would huff softly when he wanted attention, make a low rumbling sound when he was content, and produce a sharp bark when something concerned him. Most remarkably, he had learned to modulate his strength around Caleb, playing with the same gentleness he might show toward a cub dog. It was this intelligence that made the trip to town so remarkable and so controversial. Caleb had avoided bringing Bear to Cedar Ridge for obvious reasons, but the young bear's growing size made leaving him alone increasingly problematic. At 200 pounds, Bear could easily destroy the cabin if left to his own devices, and his separation anxiety had grown more pronounced as their bond deepened. The decision to bring Bear along on a supply run was practical rather than defiant, but it sent shockwaves through the small community nonetheless. Word spread through the town's single main street faster than Caleb could unload his truck, and within minutes, a crowd had gathered to witness the spectacle of a man casually shopping with a grizzly bear in tow. Bear, for his part, seemed fascinated by the new environment but showed no sign of aggression or panic. He stayed close to Caleb's side, occasionally sniffing at interesting scents but always returning his attention to his human companion when called. When a small child dropped his ice cream and began to cry, Bear approached slowly and gently nuzzled the boy's hand, a gesture that might have been terrifying if not for its obvious gentleness. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some people backed away in obvious fear, others pressed closer for a better look, and a few brave souls asked questions about Bear's training and temperament. But it was the interaction between Bear and old Mrs. Henderson that truly changed the dynamic. Martha Henderson was 83 years old, partially blind from diabetes, and possessed of the kind of fearlessness that sometimes comes with age and infirmity. When Bear approached her bench outside the post office, she extended her hand without hesitation. "Hello there, beautiful," she said in the same tone she might use with any friendly dog. "Aren't you something special?" Bear sniffed her hand carefully, then gently licked her fingers. Mrs. Henderson laughed a sound like silver bells and scratched behind his ears with the confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime around animals. "My goodness, Caleb," she called out. "This fellow has better manners than half the people in this town." The comment drew nervous laughter from the assembled crowd, but it also seemed to break some kind of spell. Bear was no longer just a dangerous wild animal. He was a creature capable of gentleness and discrimination, one who could distinguish between threat and friendship. Sarah Mitchell was among those who watched the interaction with obvious amazement. Later, as Caleb loaded supplies into his truck while Bear dozed in the shade, she approached with questions that went beyond mere curiosity. "How do you do it?" she asked quietly. "How do you know he won't just snap one day?" Caleb was quiet for a long moment, watching Bear's peaceful sleep. "Same way you know any friend won't turn on you," he said finally. "Trust builds over time. You learn each other's signals, respect each other's boundaries." "But he's not human, Caleb. He doesn't think like we do." "No," Caleb agreed. "In some ways, he thinks better, simpler. He doesn't lie or hold grudges or make promises he can't keep. When he's happy, you know it. When something bothers him, he shows you. There's no guessing with Bear." Sarah studied the sleeping grizzly with new eyes. "You really love him, don't you?" The question caught Caleb off guard, perhaps because no one had asked it so directly. He found himself thinking about the worn leatherwork gloves that hung by his back door, the ones his father had worn for 30 years of logging and farming, the ones that had taught Caleb's hands the difference between strength and violence. "My father used to say that working with your hands taught you important things," Caleb said slowly. "Patience, respect for materials, the difference between force and pressure. I think raising Bear has taught me some of the same lessons, just applied to living things instead of wood or metal." "And the town? What about their concerns?" Caleb glanced toward the small knot of people still gathered outside Mitchell's store, their voices carrying just enough for him to catch fragments of conversation. Most of it was speculation about what would happen when Bear reached full size, predictions of inevitable disaster that ranged from the merely pessimistic to the genuinely apocalyptic. "People fear what they don't understand," he said. "Can't say I blame them for that. But fear doesn't always lead to good decisions." The drive home was peaceful, with Bear riding in the truck bed and occasionally standing to catch interesting scents on the wind. As they wound through the mountain passes that led to Caleb's valley, he found himself thinking about the changes that the past year had brought to both of their lives. Bear had grown from a helpless cub into a magnificent young animal, but the transformation went deeper than mere physical development. He had learned to trust completely while maintaining his essential wildness, a balance that Caleb was only beginning to understand. More importantly, Bear had taught Caleb that it was possible to love something without trying to control it, to protect without overprotecting, to be responsible for another creature's welfare without sacrificing its essential nature. That evening, as Bear helped Caleb stack firewood by carrying smaller pieces in his mouth, the phone rang with news that would test everything they had built together. Doc Peterson's voice was grave as he delivered the message that Fish and wildlife officials had received multiple complaints about an licensed wild animal being kept as a pet. "They're planning an inspection, Caleb," Doc said quietly. "Probably within the next few weeks. I thought you should know." After hanging up, Caleb sat on his porch steps and watched Bear investigate a butterfly with the same focused intensity he brought to everything. The young grizzly's size was impressive now, but his movements still carried traces of the playful cub who had tumbled through grass chasing his own tail. The contradiction, massive strength combined with gentle curiosity, was what made their relationship possible, but it was also what made others so afraid. The worn leather gloves that hung by the door seemed to catch the evening light, reminding Caleb of his father's hands and the lessons they had taught about patience and respect. Those same principles had guided his relationship with Bear from the beginning, but whether they would be enough to convince skeptical officials remained to be seen. As darkness settled over the mountains and Bear curled up beside his chair, Caleb found himself facing a truth he had been avoiding for months. The easy part of their journey was over. What came next would test not just their bond, but their right to exist together in a world that had clear ideas about what was natural and what was dangerous, but watching Bear sleep with the absolute trust that only comes from perfect security, Caleb knew he would face whatever challenges lay ahead. Some bonds were too important to surrender without a fight, and this was definitely one of them. 2 years had passed since that morning by Miller's Creek, and Bear had grown into something that commanded respect from any creature with sense. At 350 pounds, he was still young for a grizzly, but already possessed the kind of presence that made even the boldest predators think twice about sharing territory. His coat had darkened to rich chocolate brown, and his movements carried the fluid power of an animal perfectly adapted to its environment. But it was the relationship between man and bear that truly defied explanation. What had begun as rescue and care had evolved into something that biologists would struggle to categorize: a partnership built on mutual trust and understanding that seemed to operate outside the normal boundaries between human and animal. Bear had learned to anticipate Caleb's needs in ways that went beyond simple training. When Caleb prepared for winter trap lines, Bear would wait by the door with patient alertness, somehow knowing that these trips required different behavior than their casual daily walks. When storms approached, Bear would position himself near the cabin's entrance, serving as an early warning system that was more reliable than any weather forecast. Most remarkably, Bear had developed what could only be called emotional intelligence. He seemed to sense Caleb's moods with uncanny accuracy, offering comfort during moments of melancholy and companionship during long winter evenings. When Caleb worked on mechanical projects that required concentration, Bear would settle nearby in watchful silence, content to be present without demanding attention. It was during one of these quiet moments that Caleb had discovered the family photograph tucked in his wallet, a picture he hadn't looked at in years, but couldn't bring himself to discard. The image showed him with Marie and Emma at a county fair, all three of them laughing at some long-forgotten joke. Emma was maybe 6 years old, gap-toothed and grinning, her small hand firmly clasped in Caleb's larger one, looking at the photograph. Now, with Bear dozing by the fireplace, Caleb felt a familiar tightness in his chest, but for the first time, the pain was accompanied by something else, a recognition that his capacity for love hadn't died with his family, only gone dormant. Bear had awakened it again, and while the love he felt for the massive grizzly was different from what he'd shared with Marie and Emma, it was no less profound. The realization brought with it a flood of complicated emotions. Guilt that he was betraying his family's memory by caring for another creature. Fear that he was setting himself up for another devastating loss. And underneath it all, a growing understanding of why the town's pressure to release Bear felt so much like an attack on his very identity. The pressure had been building steadily as Bear's size increased. What people could dismiss as an eccentric hobby when the pet weighed 60 pounds became a legitimate public safety concern when that same animal could overturn a car with casual effort. The complaints to Fish and Wildlife had grown more frequent and more urgent, particularly after Mrs. Kowalski claimed that Bear had menaced her poodle during one of their visits to town. Caleb knew the incident Mrs. Kowalski described was nothing more than Bear's natural curiosity about a yapping toy dog, but perception had become more important than reality. The town council had passed a resolution requesting state intervention, and several residents had started carrying firearms whenever they ventured outside the town limits. The attempted reintroduction had been Doc Peterson's idea compromise that might satisfy officials while giving Bear a chance to reconnect with his wild nature. They had driven deep into the Brooks Range, the country where grizzlies were common and human contact minimal. The plan was to spend a week camping while Bear gradually adapted to fending for himself. It had been a disaster from the first day. Bear showed no interest in foraging for natural foods. Despite Caleb's attempts to encourage exploration, he remained close to their campsite, clearly distressed by the separation from familiar surroundings. When Caleb tried to leave him alone for a few hours to simulate abandonment, Bear had followed his scent trail with the determination of a bloodhound. Covering 12 miles of rough country in less than 3 hours. By the fourth day, it was clear that Bear's idea of wild behavior meant staying within 50 feet of Caleb and helping with camp chores. He would fetch firewood when asked, alert them to approaching weather, and even assist with food preparation by holding containers steady while Caleb worked. It was impressive cooperation, but it wasn't independence. The final straw came when a wild sow with cubs appeared at their campsite, drawn by the scent of food. Bear's response wasn't territorial aggression or natural avoidance. It was protective positioning between the newcomers and Caleb, combined with vocalizations that seemed designed to communicate peaceful intentions. The wild bears eventually moved on without incident, but their presence had highlighted the fundamental difference between Bear and his truly wild cousins. "He thinks you're his family," Doc had observed as they broke camp early. "And maybe you are." The drive home had been subdued, both men understanding that they had reached a crossroads that couldn't be avoided much longer. Bear rode in the truck, Ed with obvious relief, occasionally standing to catch familiar scents as they approached home territory. When they finally pulled up to the cabin, he had bounded out of the truck and performed a thorough inspection of his domain, marking boundaries and checking for changes with the focused attention of a property owner. That evening, as Caleb sat on his porch steps and watched Bear play with a length of rope, the fundamental question that had been haunting him for months finally demanded an answer. Was keeping Bear an act of love or an act of selfishness? Was he protecting a creature that depended on him, or was he preventing that same creature from becoming what nature intended? The photograph in his wallet seemed to mock him with its frozen moment of uncomplicated happiness. Marie would have known what to do, he thought. She had possessed an intuitive understanding of when to hold on and when to let go that had made her a natural mother and a wise partner. But Marie was gone, and Caleb was left to navigate these impossible choices. Alone, Bear seemed to sense his distress, approaching with the careful attention he always showed when Caleb's mood darkened. The massive bear settled beside the steps, close enough to provide comfort, but not so close as to crowd, and made the soft rumbling sound that Caleb had learned meant contentment and security. Looking down at his unlikely companion, Caleb felt some of the evening's tension begin to ease. Whatever the future held, whatever decisions had to be made, they would face them together. Bear had chosen him as surely as he had chosen Bear, and that mutual commitment was worth defending against anyone who couldn't understand its value. The sound of an approaching vehicle interrupted his thoughts, headlights cutting through the gathering darkness as an official-looking sedan made its way up the mountain road. Caleb's stomach tightened as he recognized the Fish and Wildlife logo on the door, but Bear simply lifted his head with mild curiosity, showing no sign of alarm. The inspection he had been dreading for months was finally at hand. Asterisk, the Fish and Wildlife officials who emerged from the sedan were not what Caleb had expected. Instead of the stern bureaucrats he had envisioned, he found himself facing Dr. Rebecca Martinez, a wildlife biologist in her 40s with intelligent eyes and calloused hands that spoke of field experience, and Tom Bradley, a younger enforcement officer whose nervous energy suggested this was his first encounter with a domesticated grizzly. Bear's reaction to the visitors was immediate and telling. Rather than showing aggression or fear, he displayed what could only be described as polite curiosity. He approached the newcomers with measured steps, stopping just outside what most humans would consider their personal space, and waited with the patient attention of a well-trained dog meeting house guests. "Jesus," Bradley muttered under his breath, his hand instinctively moving toward the tranquilizer gun on his belt. "That thing is huge." Dr. Martinez, however, seemed more intrigued than alarmed. She studied Bear with the focused attention of a scientist encountering something that didn't fit established categories. "Hello there, big fellow," she said softly, extending her hand palm down for Bear to investigate. After a careful sniff, Bear gently nuzzled her fingers, the same greeting he offered to familiar humans. "This is highly irregular, Mr. Hargrove," Dr. Martinez said, her eyes never leaving Bear. "But I have to admit, I've never seen anything quite like this." The inspection that followed was thorough but fair. Dr. Martinez examined Bear's living conditions, observed his interactions with Caleb, and tested his responses to various commands and situations. She was particularly interested in the communication system that had developed between man and Bear, asking detailed questions about training methods and behavioral patterns. "He's not exhibiting any of the stress behaviors we typically see in captive bears," she noted, making entries in a leather-bound notebook. "No repetitive pacing, no self-harm, no food aggression. If anything, he seems remarkably well-adjusted." Officer Bradley remained skeptical. But what happens when he reaches full size? A mature male grizzly can weigh 800 pounds. Even if he's gentle now, natural instincts could take over at any time. Caleb understood the concern, but he also knew something the officials didn't, that Bear's natural instincts seemed to include an unusually strong drive toward cooperation and communication. The young grizzly had never shown the kind of dominance, behaviors that characterized wild bears establishing territory or hierarchy. Instead, he seemed to view his relationship with Caleb as a partnership rather than a competition. The breakthrough moment came when Dr. Martinez asked to observe Bear's response to stress. She had Bradley create a loud disturbance, banging metal objects together and shouting, while she watched for signs of aggression or panic. Bear's reaction was immediate and revealing. He moved to position himself between the noise and Caleb, but his body language suggested protection rather than attack. When Caleb gave the settle command, Bear immediately relaxed, though he maintained his protective positioning. "Extraordinary," Dr. Martinez murmured. "He's displaying protective behaviors, but they're completely under stimulus control. I've never seen anything like it." The conversation that followed extended well into the evening, with Dr. Martinez asking increasingly detailed questions about bear's development and behavior. She was particularly interested in the emotional bond between the two, recognizing something that went beyond simple training or conditioning. "You realize this puts us in an unprecedented position," she said finally. "Legally, we should confiscate him. Grizzly bears aren't domestic animals, and private ownership is prohibited. But practically speaking, this animal appears to be thriving in conditions that most wildlife experts would consider impossible." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "The law is pretty clear, Dr. Martinez. Wild animals belong in the wild period." "The law assumes that wild animals can't adapt to human partnership," she replied. "But what if that assumption is wrong? What if some individuals have the capacity for this kind of relationship?" It was then that Caleb made a decision that surprised even himself. He retrieved a small wooden box from his bedroom, the one that had held Marie's wedding ring for 20 years. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was the simple gold band that had symbolized promises kept and a future that had been cut short. "I lost my wife and daughter in a car accident 20 years ago," he said quietly, holding the ring so it caught the lamplight. "Drunk driver hit them head-on coming home from Emma's school play. I came up here to die, really. Not all at once, but slowly, day by day, year by year." The officials listened in respectful silence as Caleb spoke about his years of isolation, his careful construction of a life that required nothing from anyone and offered nothing in return. When he reached the part about finding Bear, his voice took on a different quality, warmer, more alive. "I know what people think," he continued, "that I'm some crazy old hermit who doesn't understand the difference between a pet and a wild animal. But Bear saved my life as much as I saved his. Maybe more." Dr. Martinez studied the ring in Caleb's weathered palm, then looked at Bear, who was dozing peacefully by the fireplace despite the presence of strangers in his territory. "What are you asking for, Mr. Hargrove?" "Time," Caleb said simply. A chance to prove that this works. 6 months, maybe a year. If Bear shows any signs of becoming dangerous or unhappy, I'll help you relocate him to a sanctuary. But if he continues to thrive, that's not how the system works," Bradley interrupted. "We can't make exceptions just because what?" Dr. Martinez cut him off. "Because this challenges our assumptions about interspecies relationships. Because it suggests that some bonds might transcend the categories we've created." The debate that followed was intense but civilized, with Dr. Martinez and Bradley representing different approaches to wildlife management. In the end, it was Bear himself who tipped the scales. When the discussion grew heated, he rose from his place by the fire and approached the officials with calm confidence, settling between them with the obvious intention of diffusing tension. "He's mediating," Dr. Martinez said with amazement. "Look at his body language. He's trying to reduce conflict." The temporary permit they agreed on was unprecedented. 6 months of monitored coexistence, with monthly inspections and detailed behavioral documentation. If Bear showed any signs of stress, aggression, or health problems, he would be relocated immediately. If the arrangement continued to succeed, they would consider a more permanent solution. As the officials prepared to leave, Dr. Martinez pulled Caleb aside for a private word. "I want you to understand something," she said quietly. "I'm taking a huge professional risk by allowing this. If anything goes wrong, if Bear hurts someone or even just scares them badly, it won't just be your problem. It'll be mine too." Caleb nodded, understanding the weight of responsibility she was sharing with him. "I won't let you down." "See that you don't," she replied. But her smile suggested she believed in what they were attempting, even if she couldn't quite explain why. That night, as Bear settled into his usual spot beside Caleb's chair, the simple gold ring caught the firelight from its place on the mantel. For the first time in 20 years, it wasn't a symbol of loss, but of hope, a reminder that love could take unexpected forms and that some bonds were strong enough to change the rules. Asterisk, the summer of 1989 began with the kind of weather that old-timers called ominous weeks of clear skies and bone-dry air that sucked the moisture from everything it touched. By early July, the mountains had taken on the brittle quality of kindling, and even the hardiest plants showed signs of stress. Creek beds that normally ran year-round had been reduced to scattered pools, and the usual morning mist had given way to an oppressive clarity that made distant peaks seem close enough to touch. Caleb had lived in Alaska long enough to recognize the signs of a dangerous fire season, but even his experience hadn't prepared him for the scope of what was coming. The morning that changed everything started like any other, with Bear's gentle nudging to wake him for breakfast and the familiar routine of feeding, exercise, and morning chores. They were checking the trap lines along the northern ridge when Bear began displaying unusual behavior. The massive grizzly had always been sensitive to changes in his environment, but this was different. He kept lifting his nose to test the air, his body tense with an alertness that went beyond normal caution. Several times, he stopped completely and stared toward the northern horizon, as if seeing something that Caleb's human senses couldn't detect. "What is it, big fellow?" Caleb asked, following Bear's gaze across the valley toward the distant peaks. The sky was clear, the air still, but something was clearly bothering his companion. Bear's response was a low rumble that Caleb had learned to associate with serious concern, not the kind of worry that came from spotting a stranger or hearing an unusual sound, but the deep unease that preceded genuine danger. The bear moved restlessly, alternating between sniffing the air and watching the northern skyline with focused intensity. It was nearly noon when the radio transmission crackled to life in Caleb's cabin, its emergency tone cutting through the summer quiet like a warning bell. The voice that emerged from the static belonged to the National Weather Service, and the message it carried would prove to be the most important communication Caleb had ever received. "This is an emergency broadcast for the greater Cedar Ridge area," the announcer said with professional calm that barely concealed underlying urgency. "A major wildfire has been detected approximately 50 miles north of Cedar Ridge, spreading rapidly due to extreme drought conditions and sustained winds from the northeast. Current estimates suggest the fire is advancing at a rate of 3 to 4 miles per hour toward populated areas." Caleb felt his blood turn to ice as the implications sank in. A fire moving that fast through terrain that dry would be virtually unstoppable, and Cedar Ridge lay directly in its projected path. The town's evacuation routes were limited: one main highway that wound through narrow mountain passes, and a handful of backcountry roads that most people wouldn't know how to navigate under the best of conditions. The broadcast continued with updates on evacuation procedures and emergency shelter locations. But Caleb's attention was drawn to Bear's reaction to the news. The massive grizzly had moved to the cabin's north-facing window and was staring toward the horizon with an intensity that was almost hypnotic. His earlier restlessness had given way to a kind of focused alertness that reminded Caleb of a soldier. Receiving orders. As the day progressed, the radio brought increasingly grim updates. The fire had jumped 2 major fire breaks and was now estimated to be moving at nearly 6 miles per hour faster than most people could walk through rough country. Wind conditions were expected to worsen as afternoon thermal currents developed, and several smaller communities north of Cedar Ridge had already been evacuated. By evening, the first signs of smoke were visible on the northern horizon, a thin brown haze that blurred the usually sharp outline of the peaks. Bear's agitation had grown throughout the day, and he now refused to venture more than a few yards from the cabin. When Caleb tried to coax him outside for their usual evening walk, the bear simply sat by the door and made the soft whining sounds that meant he was deeply troubled. The phone call that shattered Caleb's carefully maintained distance from community affairs came just after sunset. Mayor Collins's voice was strained with exhaustion and barely controlled panic as he explained. Situation developing in Cedar Ridge. Caleb, I know we've had our differences about your situation, but we need help, Collins said without preamble. The main highway's blocked by a rock slide, and the fire's moving faster than anyone predicted. We've got elderly residents who can't be moved by conventional means, and the backcountry routes are our only option. Caleb listened in growing amazement as the mayor outlined the town's desperate plan. With the primary evacuation route cut off, they needed guides who could lead groups of residents through the mountain trails that connected Cedar Ridge to the emergency shelters 40 miles to the south. The problem was that most of those trails required navigation skills the few residents possessed, and the approaching smoke would make visibility nearly impossible. We need someone who knows the country, Collins continued. Someone who can find their way through terrain that's going to be completely obscured by smoke. And we need, he paused, clearly struggling with what he was about to say, we need Bear. The request was stunning in its reversal of everything the town had said about Caleb and his companion for the past 3 years. The same officials who had wanted Bear destroyed as a public menace were now asking for his help in saving lives. Why Bear? Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Because he can navigate by scent when we can't see 10 feet in front of us, Collins replied bluntly. Because he knows these mountains better than any of us. And because, God help me, he might be the only thing that can get our people out alive. The irony wasn't lost on Caleb. For years, the town had viewed Bear as a dangerous anomaly, something that threatened their sense of order and safety. Now, that same creature represented their best hope for survival. The transformation in perspective was both vindication and burden-proof that their bond was valuable, but also proof that its value came with a terrible responsibility. How many people are we talking about? Caleb asked. 37 residents. Who can't be evacuated by vehicle, Collins said. Mostly elderly folks, a few disabled, some families with small children. They're gathered at the community center, waiting for instructions. Caleb looked at Bear, who was still stationed by the north window like a sentinel. The massive grizzly seemed to sense the weight of the conversation, his dark eyes reflecting an intelligence that went beyond animal instinct. We'll need supplies, Caleb said finally. Food, water, medical kit, emergency shelter. And we'll need people who can help manage groups. Doc Peterson, Sarah Mitchell. Anyone with wilderness experience. Whatever you need, Collins assured him. Caleb, I know I haven't always been supportive of what you've been doing up there. But if you can help us get our people to safety, we'll be there within the hour, Caleb interrupted. There would be time for recriminations and apologies. Later, if they all lived long enough. Right now, the only thing that mattered was the 37 lives hanging in the balanced dot as he gathered emergency supplies and prepared for what would likely be the most dangerous journey of his life. Caleb felt a strange sense of completion. For 3 years, he and Bear had lived on the margins of the community, tolerated at best and actively resented at worst. Now, their unique partnership was about to be tested in the most literal sense by fire. Bear seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. As Caleb loaded gear into his truck, the massive grizzly positioned himself by the vehicle with the patient alertness of a soldier awaiting orders. There was no playfulness in his demeanor now, no casual curiosity about their preparations. This was Bear at his most serious, a creature who understood that lives depended on his abilities. The drive to Cedar Ridge took place against a backdrop of approaching catastrophe. The northern sky had darkened to an ominous brown, and the first ash had begun to fall like gray snow. The wind carried the acrid smell of burning forest, and visibility was already beginning to decrease as smoke filtered through the mountain passes. By the time they reached the community center, the transformation in the town's attitude toward Bear was complete. Instead of fearful stares and whispered warnings, Caleb encountered grateful handshakes and expressions of desperate hope. The same people who had once demanded Bear's removal now looked to him as their salvation. It was a reversal that might have been satisfying under different circumstances, but with the red glow of wildfire painting the northern horizon, there was no time for vindication. The only thing that mattered now was whether their unlikely partnership could save the lives of people who had never believed in its value. As Bear took his position at the head of the evacuation column, calm and confident, despite the chaos around him, Caleb felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. They were about to attempt something that would either prove the power of their bond or destroy them both. The fire was coming, and there was nowhere left to run but forward. The Cedar Ridge Community Center had been transformed into something between a military command post and a refugee camp. Families huddled together with hastily packed belongings, their faces reflecting the kind of controlled panic that comes when ordinary people confront extraordinary circumstances. The elderly residents who couldn't be evacuated by conventional means sat in wheelchairs and on folding chairs, their weathered faces bearing the stoic acceptance of people who had survived enough hardships to understand when fighting was useless, and when surrender was the only option. Doc Peterson had taken charge of medical preparations, assembling a portable kit that could handle everything from heart medication to emergency surgery. At 77, he was technically too old for the kind of physical demands the evacuation would require, but his steady hands and encyclopedic knowledge of the group's medical needs made him indispensable. Sarah Mitchell was coordinating supplies with the efficiency of someone who had spent years managing the complex logistics of a small-town general store. Food, water, emergency shelter, and communication equipment were being sorted into packs that could be carried by volunteers or strapped to improvised travois for those who couldn't walk the entire distance. But it was Caleb's hand-drawn evacuation map that commanded the most attention, a detailed rendering of mountain trails and alternative routes that represented 30 years of intimate knowledge of the local terrain. The map showed not just the obvious paths, but the subtle variations in elevation and drainage that could mean the difference between safety and disaster when visibility dropped to zero. The main trail follows Miller's Creek for the first 8 miles, Caleb explained to the assembled volunteers, his finger tracing the route he had walked countless times. But if the fire jumps the creek, and it probably will, we'll need to use the secondary ridge trail. It's steeper and harder to navigate, but it keeps us above the heaviest smoke. Mayor Collins studied the map with the expression of a man who understood that he was looking at his community's last hope. How long will it take to get everyone to the emergency shelter? Under normal conditions, maybe 6 hours, Caleb replied. With this group, in smoke, probably closer to 10. Maybe 12 if we run into serious problems. The timeline was sobering, particularly since the latest fire reports suggested they had perhaps 8 hours before the flames reached Cedar Ridge. It would be a race against time with virtually no margin for error. Bear had positioned himself near the center's main entrance, his massive form drawing a mixture of awe and apprehension from the evacuees. Many of these people had never seen him up close, and his sheer size was intimidating even to those who understood he meant no harm. But there was something calming about his presence too, a sense of controlled power that suggested he could handle whatever challenges lay ahead. The breakthrough in community acceptance came when 8-year-old Tommy Martinez approached Bear with the fearless curiosity that only children possess. The boy's grandmother had been trying to keep him close to her wheelchair, but Tommy's fascination with the massive grizzly had overcome his fear. Is he really going to help us? Tommy asked Caleb, his eyes wide with wonder as he studied Bear's patient face. "He's gonna do his best," Caleb replied, kneeling down to the boy's level. "But he needs everyone to trust him, even when things get scary." Tommy reached out tentatively to touch Bear's massive paw, and the grizzly responded by gently nuzzling the boy's hand. The gesture was witnessed by dozens of evacuees, and its effect was immediate. The ambient tension in the room dropped noticeably as people began to see Bear not as a threat, but as a protector. Mrs. Henderson, the 83-year-old who had been one of Bear's first advocates in town, wheeled her chair closer to where the grizzly sat. "Hello again, beautiful," she said in the same tone she had used during their first meeting years ago. "Ready to take us all for a walk?" Bear's response was the soft chuffing sound that indicated contentment, and he moved to position himself beside her wheelchair with obvious intention. The message was clear. He understood his role and was prepared to fulfill it. The final preparations took on an urgency that bordered on desperation as the latest RDIO reports brought increasingly grim news. The fire had jumped Highway 12 and was now less than 20 miles from Cedar Ridge. Worse, the wind had shifted slightly, directing the flames more directly toward the town than earlier projections had suggested. "We need to move now," Collins announced, his voice cutting through the busy preparations. "Every minute we delay puts us further behind the curve." The evacuation column that formed outside the community center was unlike anything Cedar Ridge had ever seen. Bear took point position, his massive form clearly visible even in the growing haze. Immediately behind him came Caleb, carrying emergency communications equipment and wearing the expression of a man who understood that 37 lives depended on his ability to read terrain and weather. Doc Peterson followed with the most mobile of the elderly residents, pushing Mrs. Henderson's wheelchair while she clutched a small bag of medications and personal effects. Sarah Mitchell anchored the rear of the column with the volunteers who would assist anyone who struggled with the demanding terrain ahead. The sky had darkened to an apocalyptic orange-brown, and ash was falling steadily, now not the light dusting of earlier in the day, but thick flakes that clung to clothing and equipment. The air smelled of burning wood and something else, a chemical sharpness that spoke of structures and vehicles being consumed along with the forest. Bear's behavior during these final preparations was remarkable for its focused intensity. Gone was any trace of the playful companion who had tumbled through grass chasing butterflies. This was Bear in full working mode, alert, serious, and completely attuned to the responsibility he carried. When wind gusts brought particularly strong doses of smoke, he would position himself upwind of the most vulnerable evacuees, using his body as a living windbreak. The first mile of the evacuation proceeded smoothly, following a well-maintained trail that paralleled Miller's Creek. The group moved slowly but steadily, with Bear ranging ahead to scout for obstacles and returning regularly to check on the column's progress. His ability to navigate in the increasing smoke was already proving invaluable, while the human members of the group struggled with visibility that had dropped to perhaps 30 feet. Bear moved with the confidence of someone following a clearly marked highway. But it was during the second mile that the first real test of their partnership emerged. The trail they were following had been blocked by a massive deadfall, probably brought down by the same winds that were driving the fire. Under normal circumstances, it would have been a minor inconvenience requiring perhaps a 100-yard detour. In the current conditions, with visibility near zero and 37 people depending on efficient movement, it represented a potentially catastrophic delay. Bear's response to the obstacle was immediate and decisive. Instead of simply alerting Caleb to the problem, he began investigating alternative routes with the systematic thoroughness of a professional scout. Within minutes, he had located a game trail that would allow the group to bypass the deadfall while adding less than a quarter mile to their journey. "How does he do that?" Sarah Mitchell asked in amazement as she helped guide Mrs. Henderson's wheelchair around the fallen tree. It's like he can see things we can't." "In a way he can," Caleb replied, pausing to check his compass against the hand-drawn map. Scent trails, air currents, subtle changes in vegetation. He's processing information that our senses can't even detect. The detour was successful, but it cost them precious time and highlighted the challenge they faced. With visibility continuing to deteriorate and the fire drawing closer, every obstacle would test not just their physical endurance, but their faith in Bear's abilities. As they reached the 3-mile mark, the radio crackled with an update that sent chills through the entire group. The fire had reached the outskirts of Cedar Ridge and was consuming structures at the town's northern edge. Their former homes were burning behind them, and their only hope lay in reaching the emergency shelter before the flames caught up with their slow-moving column. It was then the bear demonstrated perhaps his most remarkable quality, emotional intelligence that seemed to transcend the boundaries between species. Sensing the group's growing despair, he began moving back through the column during rest stops, offering gentle contact to those who seemed most distressed. He would rest his massive head against an elderly man's shoulder or walk alongside a frightened child for a few hundred yards, providing comfort through simple presence. Tommy Martinez had begun crying when the radio announced that his school was on fire. But when Bear positioned himself beside the boy and made soft rumbling sounds, the tears stopped. The 8-year-old placed his small hand on Bear's thick fur and walked the next mile in companionable silence, drawing strength from the grizzly's unshakable calm. Doc Peterson, despite his age and the medical bag that grew heavier with each mile, found himself marveling at the relationship unfolding before him. "Caleb," he said during one of their brief rest stops, "I've been practicing medicine for 40 years, and I've never seen anything like this. That bear isn't just guiding us, he's taking care of us." The most dangerous part of their journey lay ahead. Miller's Canyon, where the trail narrowed to barely 6 feet wide and dropped away steeply on both sides. Under normal conditions, it was a challenging but manageable passage. In near-zero visibility with smoke-filled air that made breathing difficult, it would test every ounce of trust the group could muster in their unlikely guide. As they approached the canyon, Bear's behavior shifted again. He began moving more slowly, testing each section of trail before allowing the group to follow. His massive frame served as a living guardrail, positioning himself between the evacuees and the steepest drop-offs. When wind gusts threatened to unbalance the more fragile members of the group, Bear would shift position to provide a physical anchor point. The radio had gone silent, whether from equipment failure or because there was simply no more news to report. They were on their own now, 37 people and one extraordinary bear, racing against time and fire in a landscape that had become as alien as the surface of another planet. Mrs. Henderson, despite her age and the wheelchair that made every yard a challenge, had become something of a morale officer for the group. "That bear of yours is quite something, Caleb," she called out during one of their rest stops, her voice carrying clearly in the smoke-muffled air. "I always knew there was more to him than folks gave him credit for." As they prepared for the final approach to Miller's Canyon, Caleb found himself thinking about the compass his father had given him 30 years ago, the brass instrument that had guided him through countless miles of wilderness and was now their primary navigation tool when Bear's instincts needed confirmation. Like his relationship with Bear, it represented a connection across generations, a passing down of knowledge and trust that transcended the immediate crisis. The canyon crossing would be the ultimate test of everything they had built together. If Bear could guide them safely across that narrow passage in conditions that would challenge the most experienced mountaineer, then perhaps the bond between man and animal really could work miracles. If not, well, there would be no second chances. In the path they had chosen, as Bear took his position at the canyon's entrance, his massive form silhouetted against the smoke-filled sky, Caleb felt a surge of pride mixed with terror. They had come too far to fail now, but the margin for error had narrowed to nothing. The next few hours would determine whether their remarkable partnership was strong enough to save lives, or whether they would all become casualties of their faith in the impossible. Miller's Canyon loomed before them like the mouth of hell itself, barely visible through smoke so thick it seemed solid. The trail that wound across its narrow span had been carved from rock by decades of weathering, creating a passage that was treacherous under the best conditions and potentially suicidal in the current circumstances. Visibility had dropped to less than 10 feet. The air was filled with burning ash that made breathing painful, and the wind gusts that funneled through the canyon were strong enough to knock an adult off balance. Bear paused at the canyon's entrance, his massive head raised, to test the air currents with the focused attention of a professional navigator reading instruments. The brass compass that Caleb carried, his father's compass, worn smooth by 30 years of faithful service, confirmed what Bear's instincts had already told him. This was their route to safety, but it would demand everything they had to give. "Listen to me, everyone," Caleb called out, his voice cutting through the wind and smoke. "The next mile is going to be the hardest thing any of us have ever done. Stay close to the person in front of you. Keep one hand on the rope we're going to string. And trust Bear completely. He can see things we can't, smell things we can't, and he's going to get us across." The rope system they rigged was improvised but functional, a climbing rope secured to a Bear's harness and extending back through the column, giving each person a literal lifeline to follow when visibility dropped to zero. Bear wore the harness with patient dignity, understanding somehow that the additional weight and restriction were necessary for the group's survival. Mrs. Henderson, despite her wheelchair and 83 years, had volunteered to go first after Bear. "I've lived long enough to know when to trust my instincts," she said with a smile that was more brave than confident. "And my instincts tell me that Bear knows what he's doing." The crossing began in relative calm, with Bear moving slowly and deliberately along the narrow trail, while Caleb guided Mrs. Henderson's wheelchair with steady hands. The first 100 yards proceeded without incident, and some members of the group began to hope that the worst was behind them. Then the wind shifted. A sudden gust from the north brought a wall of superheated air and dense smoke that dropped visibility to absolute zero. The temperature spiked so suddenly that several people cried out in pain, and the acrid smoke triggered coughing fits that threatened to send people stumbling off the narrow trail. Bear's response was immediate and decisive. Instead of panicking or freezing, he dropped low to the trail surface where the air was slightly clearer and continued moving forward with unshakable determination. His deep, reassuring rumbles provided an audio beacon that the group could follow, even when they couldn't see him. It was during this blindest passage that disaster nearly struck. Harold Kowalski, a 74-year-old retirer with a heart condition, stumbled and began to fall toward the canyon's edge. In the dense smoke, no human would have seen the danger in time to respond. But Bear saw, with reflexes that seemed impossible for something his size. The massive grizzly spun around and caught Harold's jacket in his teeth, gently but firmly pulling the elderly man back from the precipice. The rescue happened so quickly and smoothly that most of the group didn't even realize how close they had come to losing someone. Harold, once he realized what had happened, began to cry, not from fear, but from gratitude. "Thank you," he whispered to Bear, his weathered hand resting on the grizzly's massive head. "Thank you, my friend." The moment of connection between the elderly man and the bear seemed to galvanize the entire group. Fear gave way to determination. Panic transformed into purpose. And the remaining crossing proceeded with the steady rhythm of people who had found their courage in the most unlikely place. Caleb watched it all unfold with a mixture of pride and amazement. The same animal that the town had wanted destroyed as a dangerous menace was now literally carrying them to safety, one careful step at a time. More than that, Bear was providing emotional support that went far beyond simple navigation. He was being the steady, reliable presence that the group needed to function under impossible pressure. The halfway point of the canyon crossing brought a brief clearing in the smoke, and for the first time in hours, they could see their destination. The emergency shelter was visible in the distance, a cluster of buildings that represented safety, medical care, and the chance to contact rescue services about other survivors. But the brief clearing also revealed something else, a wall of flame, advancing from the north, much closer than anyone had expected. The fire was moving faster than their projected timeline, and they would need to increase their pace significantly to reach safety before the flames cut off their escape route. Bear seemed to sense the urgency without being told. His movements became more purposeful, his pace increased slightly, and his periodic checks on the group became more frequent and thorough. He was pushing them now, but gently urging them forward without creating the kind of panic that could lead to fatal mistakes. As they entered the final third of the canyon crossing, with safety tantalizingly close, but the fire advancing relentlessly behind them, Caleb realized that they were about to discover whether the bond between man and bear was strong enough to work miracles, or whether they would all become victims of their faith in the impossible. The final third of Miller's Canyon tested every limit of human endurance and animal dedication. The approaching fire had created its own weather system, violent wind gusts that could knock a person off their feet, superheated air that made each breath painful, and a constant rain of burning debris that threatened to ignite clothing and equipment. Through it all, Bear continued his steady progress, his massive form serving as both guide and shelter for the 37 people who had placed their lives in his care. It was Tommy Martinez who began to falter first. The 8-year-old had been brave beyond his years, but the combination of smoke inhalation, exhaustion, and sheer terror finally overwhelmed his small reserves of strength. He stumbled and fell, his legs no longer able to carry him forward, and began to cry with the heartbreaking sobs of a child who has reached the absolute end of his endurance. Bear's response was immediate and extraordinary. Without hesitation, the massive grizzly positioned himself beside the fallen boy and lowered his body to the trail surface. The message was unmistakable. He was offering himself as a mount, willing to carry the child when human strength failed. Caleb lifted Tommy on the bear's broad back, securing him with climbing rope and whispering words of encouragement that were lost in the wind. The sight of the small boy riding the giant bear through smoke and flame had an almost mythical quality, as if some ancient legend had come to life in the midst of their modern crisis. But Bear was beginning to show signs of the tremendous strain he was under. His breathing had become labored, his movements slightly less fluid, and occasionally he would pause to shake his massive head, as if trying to clear his vision or thoughts. The smoke that was merely uncomfortable for humans was potentially deadly for an animal that relied so heavily on scent for navigation. Doc Peterson, despite his own exhaustion, recognized the symptoms of smoke inhalation in their guide, Caleb. He called out during one of their brief rest stops. Bear's in trouble. His respiratory system isn't designed for this kind of exposure. The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. In his focus on getting the group to safety, he had overlooked the toll the rescue was taking on Bear himself. The massive grizzly was literally sacrificing his own health to save people who had spent years fearing and rejecting him. As if sensing their concern, Bear lifted his great head and fixed his dark eyes on Caleb with an expression that seemed to convey absolute determination. Whatever the cost to himself, he would not abandon his responsibility to the group. The message was clear. They would reach safety together, or not at all. The final quarter mile of the canyon crossing became a race against time and fire. The flames had reached the canyon's northern rim, and burning debris was beginning to fall like deadly rain. Several members of the group had minor burns, and everyone was struggling with smoke inhalation that made breathing increasingly difficult. Bear's strength was clearly failing now. His steps had become uncertain, and twice he had to stop and brace himself against the canyon wall to maintain his balance. But each time someone in the group stumbled or cried out in distress, he found reserves of energy that seemed to come from pure determination. It was Mrs. Henderson who provided the inspiration they all needed. Despite her age and the wheelchair that made every yard a monumental challenge, she began to sing an old hymn that her generation had learned in childhood, her voice carrying clearly through the smoke-filled air. One by one, other members of the group joined in, creating a chorus of hope that seemed to give everyone the strength to continue. Bear responded to the singing with obvious pleasure, his pace becoming slightly more steady, his breathing marginally less labored. The music seemed to provide him with the same psychological boost it gave the humans, proving once again that the bond between species could transcend the normal boundaries of nature. The emergency shelter appeared through the smoke like a vision of salvation: concrete buildings with properly filtered air, medical facilities, and communication equipment that could summon help for any other survivors. They had made it. 37 people and one extraordinary bear had crossed Miller's Canyon in conditions that should have been impossible to survive. As the group stumbled into the shelter's main building, Bear collapsed. The massive grizzly's legs simply gave out, and he sank to the ground with a sound that was part sigh, part moan of exhaustion. His breathing was shallow and labored, his eyes glazed with the effects of severe smoke inhalation. Caleb knelt beside his fallen companion, his weathered hands gentle as they stroked Bear's massive head. In his pocket, he could feel the outline of Emma's hair ribbon, the small blue ribbon he had carried for 20 years as a reminder of love and loss. Now, as he watched Bear struggle for each breath, that ribbon seemed to symbolize something different. The recognition that love sometimes meant being willing to lose everything for someone else's sake. "Stay with me, big fellow," Caleb whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You got us all home. Now you need to get yourself home too." Doc Peterson was already working with the shelter's medical team to set up oxygen equipment that could be adapted for Bear's needs. The emergency shelter had been designed for human refugees, but the staff rose to the challenge of treating their unusual patient with remarkable creativity and dedication. Tommy Martinez, still exhausted but safe, approached the fallen bear with tears streaming down his face. "Is he going to be okay?" the boy asked, his small hand resting on Bear's massive paw. "He's going to be fine," Caleb said with more confidence than he felt. "Bears are tough, and this one's tougher than most." Around them, the 37 people Bear had saved were beginning to grasp the full magnitude of what had happened. They had not just been rescued, they had been transformed. The animal they had feared and wanted destroyed had literally carried them through fire to safety, asking nothing in return except the chance to fulfill his bond with the man who had saved him years ago. As Bear's breathing gradually became more steady and his eyes began to clear, Caleb felt something shift inside his chest. Not the familiar tightness of loss, but the expansion of gratitude so profound it threatened to overwhelm him. They had both survived, and in saving others, they had finally found their true purpose. Outside, the fire continued to rage, but inside the emergency shelter, surrounded by people who would never again question the power of unlikely bonds, Caleb and Bear rested together, two friends who had discovered that sometimes the most extraordinary courage comes from the simplest acts of love. 6 months after the Great Fire of 1989, Cedar Ridge had been rebuilt stronger than before. The new buildings were more fire-resistant, the evacuation routes had been improved, and the community had developed an emergency response system that would have been unimaginable before their brush with disaster. But the most significant change wasn't visible in the architecture or the infrastructure. It was evident in the way people looked at each other, and at the unlikely pair who had saved them all. The bronze plaque that now stood in the town square told the story in simple words, in grateful recognition of Caleb Hargrove and Bear, whose courage and partnership saved 37 lives during the wildfire of July 15, 1989. True heroes come in all forms. The monument had been Sarah Mitchell's idea, but the entire community had contributed to its creation, including several people who had once demanded Bear's removal. Bear had recovered completely from his smoke inhalation, though the experience had seemed to mature him in ways that went beyond the physical. The playful cub who had once tumbled through grass chasing butterflies was now a massive, dignified creature who carried himself with the quiet confidence of someone who understood his own worth. At 400 pounds, he was an impressive sight, but his gentle demeanor with children and elderly residents had made him something of a town mascot. The formal recognition had come from unexpected quarters. Dr. Martinez, from Fish and Wildlife, had returned several times to document the relationship between Caleb and Bear, and her findings had resulted in a special permit that allowed them to continue their partnership indefinitely. More importantly, their story had attracted attention from animal behaviorists and wildlife biologists around the world, contributing to a growing understanding of interspecies relationships. What you two have accomplished challenges some fundamental assumptions about the boundaries between human and animal intelligence, Dr. Martinez had told Caleb during her most recent visit. You're not just raising a bear, you're demonstrating new possibilities for cooperation across species lines. But for Caleb, the academic recognition was less important than the changes he saw in his daily life. The town that had once viewed him as a dangerous eccentric now sought his advice on wilderness safety and emergency preparedness. He had been named an honorary deputy and frequently consulted on search and rescue operations. More significantly, his isolation had ended not through any deliberate effort on his part, but through the natural process of being valued by the community he had served. Sarah Mitchell had become a regular visitor to the cabin, bringing supplies but staying for conversation that sometimes extended well into the evening. At 47, she possessed the kind of practical wisdom and quiet strength that Caleb had learned to appreciate, and her acceptance of Bear had evolved into genuine affection for the massive grizzly. You know, she said one evening as they watched Bear play with a rubber ball that seemed comically small in his massive paws, I think this is what the town needed all along. Not just someone who could help in an emergency, but someone who could show us what's possible when you look past surface appearances. The most profound change, however, was in Caleb himself. The guilt that had driven him into the mountains 23 years ago had finally begun to ease, replaced by a sense of purpose that felt both familiar and entirely new. He found his way back to being a protector and provider, not for his lost family, but for a community that had learned to trust him and a companion who had never stopped believing in him. The evening visits to Marie and Emma's grave had become less frequent, but more peaceful. When Caleb did make the drive to the small cemetery outside Cedar Ridge, he carried stories instead of apologies, updates on Bear's latest adventures, news about the town's recovery, and quiet expressions of gratitude for the love that had shaped him into someone capable of saving lives. I understand now, he said during one of these visits, kneeling beside the headstones with Bear sitting patiently nearby. You didn't save me from caring about others. You taught me how. And when the time came, I was ready. Bear had begun showing interest in finding a mate, but he showed no signs of wanting to leave Caleb's side permanently. During the spring mating season, he would disappear for days at a time, returning with the satisfied air of someone who had fulfilled important obligations. Wildlife officials had documented at least 2 successful matings, And there was speculation that Bear's unique social development might be passed on to his offspring. The possibility of baby bears, carrying some portion of Bear's remarkable temperament, was fascinating to researchers. But for Caleb, it represented something simpler, the continuation of a legacy built on trust and mutual respect. If Bear's cubs inherited even a fraction of their father's capacity for interspecies cooperation, the future might hold possibilities that no one had dared to imagine. As winter settled over the mountains once again, Caleb found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought them to this point. From the tiny, crying cub by Miller's Creek to the magnificent creature who now shared his evenings by the fire, Bear had been both student and teacher, dependent and protector, companion and inspiration. The wooden horse that had belonged to Emma still sat on the mantel, but it was joined now by other mementos: a photo of the evacuation group at the emergency shelter, a letter of commendation from the governor, and a child's drawing that Tommy Martinez had made showing a small boy riding a giant bear through clouds of smoke. These artifacts told the story of a man who had lost everything and found a way to build something new, not a replacement for what was gone, but an expansion of what was possible. Love, Caleb had learned, didn't diminish when it was shared across species lines. If anything, it grew stronger, more resilient, more capable of working miracles when the world needed them most. Outside, the first snow of winter was beginning to fall, covering the mountains in pristine white that would soon transform the landscape into something clean and new. Bear dozed by the fire, occasionally making the soft rumbling sounds that Caleb had learned meant perfect contentment. While the wind carried the promise of adventures yet to come, they had found their place in the world, these unlikely partners, and the world had found room for the extraordinary bond they represented. Sometimes, Caleb reflected as he watched the snow accumulate outside his windows. The most impossible relationships turned out to be the most necessary ones. And sometimes, just sometimes, love really was enough to change everything.